A southern sea otter. No blubber at all, just dense fur. And a metabolism so fast, she must eat a quarter of her body weight daily to survive the cold. What happens when the forest that feeds her runs out?
This kelp can grow 2 feet a day, one of the fastest growing living things on Earth. But to the north, forests just like it have already lost more than 95% of themselves in barely a decade.
What's kept that collapse from reaching this coast isn't luck. It's her, working this water every single day. Here, the forest survives because the otter never stops eating. 95% of a forest just like this one, gone within a decade, to the north. And here, off Point Lobos, she surfaces between 2 thinning stands of kelp, forepaws working the water, scanning the open gaps where a fuller canopy used to close overhead. A canopy this thin doesn't just mean less to eat, it means less to hide inside. And right now, 40 feet out past the last standing fronds, something long and gray has just crossed into open water. For a southern sea otter, there is no armor against this. She has no blubber to cushion a bite, no burst of speed to outrun an animal built for open water. Her only real defense is never being caught without cover in the first place. She holds still now, only her eyes moving, tracking the shape as it drifts along the tree line of kelp. Just offshore, a great white shark is doing what great whites have increasingly learned to do along this coast in recent years, hunting water that used to be too thick with kelp to enter at all. She doesn't wait to find out whether this shark has noticed her. She drops straight down through the thinning stand, angling not for open water, but for the densest remaining tangle of stipes and holdfast she can reach. The one place a shark this size can't easily follow. Weaving low between the anchor points, she puts 3, 4, 5 lengths of kelp between herself and open water, and waits. Above her, a long shadow passes once along the edge of the canopy, unhurried, and moves on. This is the whole strategy. Not outrunning the danger, but never being caught somewhere the danger can reach her. The shark moves on, unhurried, to hunt somewhere else along this same thinning edge of coast, for now. She stays low in the kelp a moment longer than she needs to, muscles still coiled, before finally pushing back up toward the surface. The danger doesn't really leave when a shark does. It just becomes the water she has no choice but to raise a pup in. Wrapped twice around in a coil of kelp so she won't drift while her mother dives, a pup barely 3 weeks old floats alone at the surface, eyes still only half open, calling in short, high notes every few seconds until he hears an answer. A pup this young cannot dive, cannot groom the air pockets into his own fur that keep a sea otter from drowning in its own weight, and cannot feed himself for another 5 to 6 months. Every calorie he needs has to come from her. On top of the roughly 1/4 of her own body weight she already has to find, just to keep her own metabolism running hot enough to survive the cold. In a healthy kelp forest, that math is difficult. In a forest thinning toward barren rock, it borders on impossible. Fewer dense patches mean longer swims between meals, and every minute she isn't hunting is a minute her pup is floating alone on the surface, exposed. She tucks him tighter into his kelp anchor, checks the canopy once, and dives. "20 feet down, wedged into a crevice in the reef, she finds exactly what she needs. A red abalone clamped flat against the rock, its shell locked down by a single powerful muscle, strong enough to resist almost anything that isn't patient. She works her claws under the rim first, then wedges a fist-sized rock she carried down with her into the gap, levering and twisting until the muscle finally gives and the shell comes free. 60 seconds underwater, maybe less, and she's already kicking back toward the surface, with dinner enough for both of them. She surfaces still holding both the rock and the abalone, and her pup's calls change pitch instantly. Recognition, not distress. She rolls onto her back, abalone balanced on her chest, and lets him nurse first. Tonight, the math worked, but the patch of reef that just fed them both is smaller than it was last season, and smaller than it will be the season after. And somewhere beyond the edge of this kelp stand, in water thinning toward rock, that math is only getting harder to solve. The light is already fading toward evening by the time she's covered nearly 200 meters of open, exposed water since leaving the last dense stand of kelp behind. Every stroke of it, a stretch where a shark could close the distance before she'd even see it coming. Then, finally, the seafloor ahead changes color. Not the bleached white and purple of urchin barren, but the deep, textured green of living kelp holdfasts, thick with shellfish that have had a full season to grow undisturbed. This is the last real patch for over a kilometer in any direction. She has learned that the hard way, covering this same exposed stretch of water every few days for weeks now, ever since the closer patches stopped being worth the dive. If this one goes the same way, the nearest alternative means a swim nearly twice as long, through water with even less kelp left to disappear into. Finding food here isn't only about tonight's meal. It's about whether there's still a reason to come back to this stretch of coast at all. She works the healthy patch methodically, testing one urchin after another with a forepaw before committing. She has learned that urchins from a thinning edge are barely worth the dive. Spines over an almost empty test, days from starving even as they cling to the rock. This one, deep in undisturbed kelp, is heavy with exactly what she needs. She surfaces with it, rolls onto her back, and settles a flat stone she carried up against her chest as an anvil. 3 sharp strikes, then a 4th, and the test finally cracks open along its seam. For a sea otter, there is no separate meal later. This has to be enough now to offset the swim that got her here and the one that will take her back. And it is. She eats everything, methodically, floating on her back with the current carrying her slowly toward denser cover. She'll make this same crossing again in a few days, and the days after that, for as long as this last patch holds out. Multiply her by roughly 3,000 other otters making the same crossing, solving the same math, up and down this coast. And the reason this particular stretch of California still has a kelp forest at all stops being a mystery. Take her out of this water, and the urchins she keeps in check would strip this kelp to bare rock within years. The collapse that already erased the forests to the north, where the sunflower sea star never recovered from its own wasting disease. Red abalone would lose their last kelp too. Even the sharks here are, in part, a symptom of the same unraveling. So how does a marine mammal with no blubber keep from starving as her forest shrinks? Not through any reserve. She has none. She survives how she did today, crossing water she'd rather not cross, testing every urchin before she trusts it, taking only what she needs. The forest survives because she never stops eating. She survives because there's still enough of it left.